All right. Okay. I'm stressing out about the intro because I blew it.
Welcome to the next episode.
Welcome to the very first ChUG Podcast of 2021. That's what I'm going to say just now.
Oh, it'll be remembered forever.
Well, welcome everybody to the very first podcast of 2021 with the ChUG group. ChUG is the Chicago user group in cytometry. We like to talk about everything flow cytometry related. Today, we're here with a bunch of interesting people. You might recognize Kelly Lunson as the guest of our last podcast, which turned out great. I thought it was super interesting. Kelly came out of it and said, "You guys need help." And so she came up with the idea for the future podcast that the broadcast so we're gonna present to you guys. And so really happy to have her on board. She actually used to live in Chicago. She used to be my neighbor in Central and Milwaukee. Before we get started, I'm gonna have you guys introduce yourself with a few words about what you do and how long have you been in the flow cytometry world? Want to start with Kelly?
Okay, so I've been in the field for about maybe a little over 15 years, like 15 to 18 years. Most people know me either from molecular probes, in Vitrogen, helping them with fluorescent reagents, or through BioLegend with the brilliant violets and that sort of thing. But now I'm doing consulting for software, instrumentation, and reagents in the cytometry space.
So Mr. David Novo.
Hi, everyone. My name is Dave. I saw my first flow cytometer probably 25 years ago and stuck the first tube on the first flow cytometer that I ever used around then. More recently, now I run Novo software, which makes flow cytometry and image cytometry data analysis software. And I've been doing that for the last long time.
We have Mr. Geoff Kraker joining us as well.
Yep, I've been around flow in one shape or another for probably 12 or 13 years, ballpark. Started out at the Flow Core in Northwestern, also in Chicago. So that's where I met these wonderful people. And actually, that's where I met Dave for the first time too. So it's a great era of life. Definitely a shout out to them. I was in the core there for a while, and then I historically have worked at Cytobank for quite a long time. That's where you may know me from. And I'm now at Cytek BioSciences. So a little bit more in the hardware side of things, but still very much plugged into the software and analysis world.
And you, David, you should introduce yourself.
People know me. I'm David Leclerc. I run the flow cytometry facility. It is cytometry and antibody technology facility at the University of Chicago. So it's basically the merging of the monoclonal facility and flow cytometry lab. I've had this position since 2016 when I defeated Ryan Duggan in a TC.
I saw that on YouTube.
Yeah.
It was very
yeah. It was close for a while, but then yeah, I've been in flow cytometry for did my master's in flow cytometry, and then I've been in the field for 15, 16 years, give or take. And so, yep. Kelly, this was your idea, this podcast. So tell us about what we're going to talk about today.
I have to say, I learned everything that I know about software. Most of us biologists, software is not coming naturally. It isn't like all of a sudden you're like, oh, this language, I get all these acronyms. Nobody gets it. You know, it's such a challenge for all of us to be able to use software to the ultimate potential. And these two definitely have taught me most of everything that I know, including when Nick Ostrat was at FlowJo. He taught me a ton too. But owe a lot to these guys for the patience with which they will methodically walk through. They will meet you in hotel rooms. They'll meet you. Okay, that sounds a bit bad, but they will meet you in the lobby of hotels to walk through data that you have to present in a half hour, just to make sure that there's nothing that you missed, and that that kind of care is something that is not common. So I very much appreciate both of you in my world. Oh, stop.
Oh, stop.
Shush. So we, we want to have the ChUG podcasts. First of all, ChUG used to be us drinking beers at a local pub in Logan Square.
3 of us. I mean,
I have to say, I really miss. I wouldn't mind if we were drinking beers during these podcasts.
It'll get back there soon.
ChUG for a reason. But we want to start focusing a little bit more on particular topics, not having it webinars so much. We can all tune into 1,000,002 webinars where we go over data and strengths and weaknesses, in a real technical sense. But we have so many people that are so interesting in this space that were there at the beginning and are ushering us through new technology. And I would really like to talk more one-on-one, with people that have fundamentally changed our space and have a vision for where we're going in the future. So I'd like to see us do this once a month at a minimum, maybe twice a month when we have Cyto and we're all excited and twittering about, or Twitter-pated about something that we learned at Cyto or AAI after we've all seen each other for, the first time in now probably 2 years.
right.
Maybe then we'll have like an extra podcast that month. But, next month we're going to have Prateep, who's kind of like Cher, since none of us can pronounce his last name. It's Chattopadhyay, right? Prateep's last name?
I've managed to get away for 15 years without having to say it. So I consider that a success.
I mean,
Eponymous.
you're a diva of flow cytometry. I think you just get to go by your first name. It's fine.
Mhm.
He'll be in February talking about, much like Dave, he's been around for a little longer than the rest of us and have a better historical perspective. And then maybe, talk about Cytof on another one and talk about single cell sequencing and what that means for flow cytometry and, just find people that are influential in the field for each month. So I think that's kind of our goal right now for 2021, at least one a month. Maybe Johnny Moore will join us if we can get her, since she's the president of ISAC right now. And holy God, I can't even imagine to hear about her career as a woman and a leader in this space. So yeah, how does that sound, everybody?
Sounds good.
Yeah, great lineup.
I think you're on the right track for sure.
And you guys are the first ones. You're like the rock stars.
Are the guinea pigs? I'm not
Guinea
sure.
pigs. For sure, guinea pigs.
We needed the friendliest ones to be the guinea pigs. All right, so
Oh no, I was about to. So today's podcast, we wanted to talk about the history of analysis software. Basically, this is stuff that kind of taken for granted, but when I first started, we were working with WinMDI at my facility, in my lab where I did my master's. It's very later that I came across actual platforms, third-party platforms to analyze the data, and it's something that we thought would be really interesting to get into.
What is WinMDI?
WinMDI is, Dave will correct me, but I think it was programmed by. It doesn't help when I can't remember anybody's name.
Joe Trotter.
Yes, Joe Trotter. And it was basically a free platform that would run on Windows 3.1, I believe, or Windows 95. And people would use that to analyze their flow data. The batch option would just send everything to the printer, and that's how you would get all your analysis done. So it was really nice software that everybody was using.
And how many parameters would you have had?
I mean, this is early technology, so I'm guessing, 2 lasers, 4 detectors, forward side scatter.
That's about right.
Yeah. So maybe that's a good point to start.
Yeah.
So, Dave, I think you're the first one who got your hands on the flow cytometer around here. So what was the scene on the analysis software way back then?
Yeah, I mean, it was definitely primitive. That being said, the flow cytometers then were primitive, right? So it wasn't necessarily like out of the ordinary, you know, they were appropriate for the time. But, you know, when I started, probably the state of the art software, like the best software at the time was CellQuest. It was really revolutionary and wonderful compared to what was available before. And it really was a beautiful software for, you know, the early 90s when it was around. And that was the first software that I started with. Of course, it was available only for the Macs. And at that time, Macs were not that widely used in the academic world.
Why was that? Why was it so heavily Mac dominated? Just because that's what programmers would use? Or?
It was PC dominated. I think mostly, like usually the only Mac in the lab was the one that was connected to the flow cytometer in many cases. And maybe they bought some extra Macs just to run CellQuest in the flow core. And they were never allowed to be connected to the network because the IT staff of the university didn't know what to do with them. You know, and that's changed a lot for various business reasons. And, you know, Mac really did not focus early on at businesses and sort of enterprisey level people. They were really focused on the home consumer and graphics in the early days. Why BD wrote CellQuest on the Mac, I have no idea. I have no idea. But that was there. But, you know, you had to buy a Mac and you had to buy CellQuest, which was thousands of dollars if you bought a standalone software. And there weren't a lot of options for Windows people and who wanted offline analysis. As David said, WinMDI was probably the most popular. And it was wonderful. Joe Trotter wrote it, and for its day, I mean, it was really great. It actually inspired me because I was using it for quite a while before I found out that it was just one person who wrote it, you know, and he wrote it in his spare time as a core facility manager, I think at the time at Scripps. And so I was kind of like, it was one of those things where like, well, if one person can write this, maybe one person can write something else. And so it was a real inspiration. And the very first versions of FCS Express actually were, some of the features were modeled after what he had, and some of the features were modeled to specifically correct the deficiencies that I saw, that I encountered when using it.
So
but there was also
wrote FCS Express though, right?
Like, yeah, at the beginning. Certainly like, at the beginning, it was just
biologist.
I was a biologist, but yeah, I had a lot of spare time at that moment of my life. And I had a background in computers, and I was working in Howard Shapiro's lab at the time in Boston, and literally didn't know anybody at all because I had just moved there for 9 months to work with him. And so when you have every evening to do absolutely nothing, you know, there was a lot of spare time to play around. And that's kind of what I did, because we were doing some analysis in the lab that WinMDI couldn't do. There was WinList at the time, which was the first, you know, really probably commercial flow cytometry software that I know of, third party. And it was very powerful, and still is very powerful software in terms of the kinds of analysis it can do. But, you know, basically Howard just didn't want to pay for it at the time. So
he is the best.
He is a very do-it-yourself kind of guy, both with the cytometers and with the software. So yeah, so that's what happened. So, you know, at the beginning, WinMDI would do everything that you needed. It was really great. You know, the name actually came from, if I recall correctly, when you opened up Visual C++ at the time that it was written, the default program, that the default name of the default program is literally called WinMDI, Windows Multiple Document Interface. And so Joe, as far as I understand, just kept the default name from the default project. Who was the developer
here.
And everybody started using it. So, I mean, I think people are still using it today. Joe told me that when he went to work for BD, he still continued improving it and probably put in a lot of cool stuff, but, you know, didn't release it anymore because he obviously had other things going on.
Can I ask you guys both, actually, start with David, but do you find a lot of people like us, just normal users, who don't use any commercial software, like who either use the acquisition software for analysis, like Diva? How common is it to find people that make their own solution?
I mean, I wouldn't say the acquisition software with the instrument is really their own. I mean, for that answer, the answer is yes. There's a huge number of people who just don't feel the need to use anything but what comes with the instrument because they're doing reasonably basic experiments. I don't know, today there's probably more than there's ever been who roll their own solution using various scripting languages. Probably 5 years ago, you never found that at all.
You agree with that, Geoff?
Yeah, I mean, I think part of it is, and I fall prey to this too, is that we all live and breathe flow because it's the only thing that we see. But especially if you're in a core or if you're FAS out somewhere talking to people, there's so many people that use flow as like one figure in a much larger paper. And so they put on some grad student and they're like, hey, go down on the flow core, run this experiment, try and figure it out. And like Dave said, it was, they're usually less complex. So they just want stats out, could some of those things be converted to a Western blot? Do they need to be single cell if it's, like at that point? Yeah, but flow is nice. I'm kind of partial to it. So yeah, I mean, I think there's an enormous number of people who are outside of kind of this bubble that, me and I think all of us live in, that yeah, I mean, they just end up using Diva or SpectraFlow or whatever to interact with their data and then leave it at that.
I'm kind of curious to see. So it used to be that you would buy an instrument that would come with a acquisition software, and the level of analysis that you could do was kind of nice. And I think it got scaled back over time just for the sake of giving the users an interface that's more intuitive, so you don't have these analysis tools kind of in the way of you getting decent data. So I'm not sure if I'm completely right in this, but this is something that I remember mid 2010s, we were talking about like get rid of analysis stuff when you give me a acquisition software. We don't need it. We're going to use something else. I'm not sure if I'm right there.
I think it's kind of a chicken and egg. Is it that decreased so people started buying third-party software, or is there enough third-party software out there as options where people say, no, I don't care about having really nice features in Diva or again, pick your acquisition software.
I think it's also at the very beginning, there was not really much of a difference between the analysis, the sophistication of the analysis you had to do offline and the sophistication of the analysis you needed to do at the machine. I mean, you had your 4 colors, you had your 8 plots, you could do it right on the machine. You weren't doing hundreds of repetitions. And then as sort of time went on, the requirements for the analysis just got more and more and more and more and more. And it's difficult to put in. And it's interesting from a point of view that, people have told me for 25 years that one day BD was going to wake up and write the ultimate analysis software and we would be put out of business. And because they have $1 gajillion of resources, and how is there any hope that third-party analysis software could ever compete against
we're
these?
Still waiting.
So. Yeah, unfortunately, we're still waiting.
They seem to like Diva a lot, at least.
And the fact is that it's just it takes a lot of resources to build good analysis software. And from an economics point of view, the money that we make is peanuts compared to like a BD or a Coulter. What they make on reagents is what our budget is like the budget they spend on labels for the reagents for the entire year, So to devote that much effort to making analysis software analysis capabilities in the acquisition software didn't often make sense. Kaluza did make Coulter does make Kaluza, which is nominally an analysis software. And it has its good points. I wouldn't say that I've seen tons of new features being added to it over the last 10 years. But there is a notable exception to the trend.
So that kind of takes us to the next question. As you were talking, what I'm thinking is, okay, so it was really simple analysis, right? We couldn't get more than like 4 parameters, or 4 fluorescent parameters. So what do you think was the paradigm shifter? When did it become that people were like, no, I need to write my own algorithm for this because I need to do cell cycle, I need to do side population, I need to do something that was outside of the scope of what was, provided. And when you were starting your business, first of all, how did you know you had a business? Like, you had that much confidence cytometry was going to take off. Like, you had that vision to know that it was going someplace that was worth going. But what was the big changer? What was the game changer that took us to the next stage?
I could spin it that this was all a premeditated, brilliant business decision where I analyzed the growth markets of, but it wasn't anything like that at all. I mean, it was really, at the beginning, I wrote some software, and by the end of my time with Howard, it wasn't that much less sophisticated than WinMDI was, and some other things as well. And I just gave it a try, and the first versions were $99. And if it didn't work, it didn't work. That was fine. And as I was selling it through grad school, it sort of afforded me money to go to the bar that my grad school salary didn't afford. And so, I got to go to Cyto. It did make enough money to pay for certain trips and stuff. And my PI was very kind, and we came to an arrangement, and he let me go. And, by the time it was done, which is already 5-6 years later, I could see that it was a sustainable business at that time. And I never really, was like, oh, well, is this, of course, in hindsight, I should have invented Facebook compared to, flow software if I really wanted to make money. But yeah, so it was not just life happens, and that happened along with it.
But like in cytometry, what changed? Was it the fact that we got past a certain number of parameters, or we got to different kinds of indicators, or, like cell cycle? What was it that was like, oh, I need to make a second version of this. Oh, I need to make a third version of this. Oh my gosh, this is growing so fast. How can I keep up with all these new applications, all these new demands on the software? Like, how did that go for you?
So, I mean, remember, all this high dimensional analysis stuff is very trendy now and very cool, but people were buying software with new versions and new capabilities for 15 years or before that all came to fruition, right? Or became all the things converged that made that possible, which quite a few things needed to converge. But people always need even though things didn't explode to 20 colors or 30 colors until recently, but colors were always being added. People were acquiring more cells the machines got faster, so they could acquire more cells. So the processing needed to be better. It wasn't necessarily that people needed to do so much more sophisticated analysis, but you had people doing stuff with robots running 24/7, and they had to analyze 1,000 data files as part of a giant, HTS experiment. And so, yeah, sure, it was only 2 colors or 3 colors or 4 colors. The actual analysis wasn't complicated, but how to push 1,000 data files through in a reasonable amount of time and get out the results that they needed, was. So, things did get more complicated all the time, and the requirements changed all the time. The latest one that Geoff is quite an expert in and knows a lot about is just the convergence of the explosion in the number of colors that the machines are capable of analyzing, the explosion in the home computers that they can actually crunch numbers fast enough, and the explosion in algorithms that a lot of researchers are using primarily in other fields and bringing to flow cytometry. And when those things all come together, then that's sort of the latest one. But it's not like, we were in the dark ages until 7 years ago when all of a sudden, we went above 2 colors.
Right.
Are on that same line, are there any landmarks over time where any changes in the technology, either on the computer side or on the flow cytometry side, kind of disrupted either your own software or any software on the market? I'm thinking like,
From
switching.
my experience, I mean, if you were looking for, if you got to 12 colors, which is easily a big still, the 8 to 12 color market is still the bread and butter currently and has been probably for like the last 10 years. Wouldn't you guys agree with that? Like,
Yes.
without having to get too complicated. But if you're looking for a rare event, you had to acquire so many events to get there. And that's when my computer would always die. So I completely agree with you on just like the processing speed, the processing capability as the computers got to be able to handle, as the cytometers could dump that much information more quickly and get us more events. And then, the size of those files, that was, to me, that's definitely a paradigm shifter, where you had to not sit there and wait for your computer to think about it for half the day.
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely a challenge. The size of the data files did run ahead of most people's computer speeds for quite a while. Now I think that computers come with 8 cores and 32 gigs of RAM for not very much money. I think things are mostly under control except for the most extreme cases today, but there was a time where that was really challenging. And it's funny because at the very beginning of computers, you fought for every byte, and every bit and being totally memory efficient. And then computers went to like 4 gigs and 8 gigs, and the whole rest of the world forgot about that. And everybody had more, except for flow cytometry, where people would be using this 6-7-year-old computer for every other scientific application that they had. Every Word, Excel, everything was on this computer that practically had a mouse wheel attached to it to have the mouse powering it. And then they try to run these 10 million event 4-color data files on it and call and complain that things weren't going well.
It's kind of Geoff. I definitely remember the first time you gave me tutorials in Cytobank, because I was like, I'm dying here. This is not working for me. There has to be a way. And I remember your first tutorials with me was Cytobank, and you're like, oh, you can just let it run in the background. You can just close it.
That's actually, I think that's maybe skipping ahead here a little bit, but I think it's a great segue to say, I think Dave has a good point where saying, the technology, the hardware technology, the computers, processors, RAM, et cetera, is reasonably stable now, but especially now that much higher parameter data files, spectral just in general is letting people look at so many more channels, and they still want to look at 2, 5, 10 million events per file. And I've definitely seen this evolve. The CyTOF, even though it was a lot of parameters, because the acquisition speed was much more reasonable in terms of looking at the data files, they didn't ever end up being that enormous. But now that you can look at 40 parameters or 40 colors, more parameters, 40 colors for a couple million events a file, especially if it's a trial, if you're looking at 50, 80, 120 different samples. There's people who, they need to function more in a space, that's more performant than even a desktop. So I think that's definitely the trend, is people moving towards, cloud assistance in some way. And there's a couple platforms out there now, not naming names, but I think that's going to be the direction that people are looking for, is trying to offload this. And this has happened for other fields, for genomics and stuff. People would have high performance compute clusters. By people, I mean like pharma companies, like people with a lot of money would have these HPC clusters doing alignments and stuff. And that, so it's kind of,
wait, what did you just say? What's an HPC?
It's like a high performance compute, basically just a lot of processors, a lot of memory.
So it had been like a hardware system that would have been implemented by Apple or Microsoft in order to handle the computing power for what many researchers needed?
I mean, probably not Apple or Microsoft. Like there, a lot of the times they were Linux based, and they'd be like mini supercomputers, basically, big server racks, and a lot of pharma companies still have these systems in place.
That makes sense. I mean, I worked at Celera Genomics. We had an entire room in the center of the building that housed all the computers. So I'm kind of imagining computing center akin to that.
Yeah, basically. Yeah, and so I mean, those, I mean, just across the board are kind of going out of style as people realize, cloud computing is more economical. I don't have to maintain security for my on-premises hardware. I don't have to deal with upgrading the equipment or it breaking or whatever. So that's, I mean, Amazon, Google, Microsoft, they all have their solutions.
Wasn't that a big barrier to entry though for Cytobank, that people did not want to put their data on the cloud because it seemed too amorphously insecure to them?
Everybody early on was so gun shy about putting their data online.
I don't understand. I think you guys must have the hardest job trying to translate all of this to people like us. I don't know how my cell phone works. I don't understand how Wi-Fi works. I don't understand. It's like, it must be frustrating.
I mean, at some point, I mean, this goes beyond me, and I'm sure Dave's looked into it too. But you have to say, okay, we're going to have our security people talk to your security people, and we're going to hash out. So at this point, there's a lot of people, both in the academic and the industry side, are kind of up to speed on what cloud computing is and how secure it is, and things like that. So I think it's getting easier for people to talk about it and to accept it as normal. But especially back in like 2012, 2010, 11, 12, people were not on board. For sure.
Yeah, back then people had more of a irrational fear of what they didn't understand.
Yeah.
Now people have a rational fear.
Nobody has that.
Yeah, they have a rational fear.
Exactly. Now they have a rational fear of cloud computing. So at least only in the circumstances where it actually is, at least they're focused on the real concerns, and of which there are many, but at least they're the real ones, and not it's just all terrible all the time.
Like,
everybody will have access to my data.
Like, what would a specific concern be right now for the web? Because from what I understand, I listened to a bunch of techie podcasts on the cloud at one point, so that I understood there were multiple servers across the world even that were housing just mirror images of your data, so that should one of them fail, am I on?
If you pay for that, yeah.
One of these NPR
podcasts. That is possible. That is, some people have it set up that way. Yeah.
Okay. But is that, what would a weakness of it be then? Like, is it?
Well, every company that has data on the cloud's been hacked. I mean, basically is just unavoidable. So, you sort of have to presume, if you're going to be secure, that your data is going to get hacked. I mean, every single one of our social security numbers and bank account numbers and whatever is on the web at this moment with our addresses right now, due to the various breaches at Anthem and banks and all these places that are nominally far more secure than any flow cytometry cloud solution could ever be.
Yeah.
And they all got
hacked. They're going to want my data.
Yeah.
It's a hot commodity.
So that's just a challenge. So a lot of companies that have, sensitive drug companies, for example, would be much more leery about putting their proprietary data on the cloud than, if you're Joe researcher who's doing a one-off experiment about something, for example.
Yeah, I mean, that's what the journey has been. And a lot of those people very much were very cautious, and still are. There's a lot of we'll call it hoops to jump through, I think, to get on the security. I mean, it varies per company, but to get on the good side of their security team. At one point, they were like, no, we can only do on-premises. We can install your software onto our computers here on our site. And we had to say, okay, well then, I mean, just give us access to your network then, so we can make sure that, the software is working. They were like, oh, no, we definitely can't do that. Okay, all right, we can put our data on your cloud. and there's, I mean, a lot of it is de-identified enough, and there's, again, there's a lot of steps that people are taking very carefully to make sure that data is safe on the cloud. But yeah, I mean, it's a consideration. You have to kind of balance risk, kind of across the board. So, if you're doing experiments that only server computers can handle, I mean, you have to give it a good hard think. But yeah, that's definitely a consideration.
So David, I know in fluorophores, if we had known we were going to 40, we would have made different choices when we were at 10. You know what I mean? Are there certain decisions that were made early on that you had to go back and be like, no, I've got to resculpt that paradigm? Like maybe at the time it was the right decision, but it's going to become a hindrance later on.
I mean, the only decision that was really made that is out of our control in terms of, we write software so we can do whatever we want within our thing is the FCS file format. I think there were choices made that were very, very rational at the time that don't make sense necessarily that much today.
Is there any specific that you can point to?
The way the data is organized is not necessarily in the file where it's organized cell by cell instead of parameter by parameter, for example, probably is not that useful today. Some limitations that recently trying to address that every parameter of data has to be the same data type. So if you have floating point data, every parameter has to be floating point. If you have integer data, every parameter has to be integer. Those all made sense at the time when and for the purposes the first standard was made for. But are they perfect for today? Not really. But I do have to say it doesn't matter. Like all of that stuff doesn't matter. Like reading a file format, as long as it's, the main problem with the FCS standard is not the standard. It's that every vendor has decided to arbitrarily, I wouldn't say decided, that's mean. Things have gotten misinterpreted, misunderstood. Yes. Nobody went back to a central body to clarify anything, and there was actually no punishments or ramifications if you did do it wrong. So things just, didn't go 100% according to the standard. But, as long as the standard is written, then as a vendor like ourselves, you just parse the data and then you put it into whatever format internally makes sense for your application to use. So there's a lot of debate about very particular nitpicky things and what's better and what's worse and how we should do it. And at the end of the day, it's not really that important as long as it's clear and ideally everybody adheres to it.
So is there a standard written now that everyone adheres to?
There's a standard.
Can I, so just this month, the version FCS 3.2 was published in Cytometry Part A. And I might be wrong, but I feel like the way this particular paper was written, the tone is very different than the previous ones. Where before it was more of a, this keyword does this parameter does that, and then it's kind of a, not knowing much about computing, it was much of a, like, trying to get people to agree on the thing that would promote and facilitate the analysis of the data. And this particular paper seems to me was written by people who are actually like knee deep in this stuff, and like
Who wrote it? Who are you? Sorry, I didn't read it before you sent it. Before we got on.
Joseph
Sorry.
Diedlin, Wayne Moore, David Parks, and so on. Like Ryan Brinkman is involved. It seems to me that it's a bunch of people who actually play with these FCS files day in, day out, and the way they wrote is very to the point, very specific. So
yeah, a lot of this particular one was to address misconceptions and kind of clean up the standard a bit. It was quite technical. Again, because there were a lot of keywords introduced that nobody used. a lot of keywords introduced that the explanations were not necessarily 100% clear what they were supposed to be used for.
Yeah.
And then various vendors came up with their own understanding
Oh,
of it. But you know, this misinterpretation continues to today. There is a vendor, very modern vendor, whose name shall remain nameless, but you know, who took the volume keyword and stored it in, I forget what it was. They stored it in milliliters when the standard clearly says that the volume keyword should be in nanoliters. You know, and this is not, you know, so this is just, it's just people who, it's a complicated standard. It's very detailed. And these kinds of mistakes are made all the time over the last 20 years, which makes writing a universal FCS parser only really feasible for people who, like us, who kind of have a very built-in incentive to have everything work for every possible vendor.
Yeah, I can't tell you how much. I mean, there was again, not naming names with what vendor did what, but there's an FCS file. It looks like a 3.1 or a 3.0 on the outside, and there's a kind of a bin in the middle, without getting too technical. And they just decided to shove an entire FCS 2.0 copy of that same file into this particular FCS file. So it's like nested inside. Makes it really hard to read, and we were banging our head against a wall for a while, trying to get that one figured out. And so people take liberties. I think the lesson here is that it's definitely at this point the FCS standard is a goalpost that, you know, a lot of people fall short from. Some people are doing it really well. Others are a little more loosey-goosey for sure.
So let's, I think
Can I ask you one really geeky question real quick about FCS 3.2? Maybe we don't know yet, but like, there's a keyword called unstained centers and another one called unstained info. That is basically, can somebody explain what, can you explain to me what those are?
No.
Not sure, okay. It caught my eye because it's a weird.
I mean, honestly, one of the funny things is I don't really deal with the like nobody, you cannot implement an FCS parser from the standard because there are millions of permutations of everything. And if you wrote an actual code that handled from the standard every possible FCS file that could be written, that's all you would do for the rest of your life. So we really deal with, as vendors add and use keywords from files, we will support those new keywords, but we very rarely proactively pick a keyword that nobody in the world is using and implement it and try and do something with it.
Right.
But I do have to give a shout out to all the people on those papers in the, you know, who work on it, Dave and Joseph and whatnot. I can't overstate how, I don't know if the word is tedious or detailed or mind-numbing it can be to discuss the minutia of where to put the comma in a in a standard file like this, but it's actually very important to have it thought through and done well. So those guys are very detail oriented and very thoughtful about all the possibilities and generally come up with a really good solution for what they're doing.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a lot of work. I've sat in on a couple of those meetings for just a little bit, and it's very detail oriented, and it's a really sharp bunch of people who are kind of steering the standard these days.
You know, I mean, that's exactly when I was at Celera Genomics, and they, you know, you had different sets of people. You had people that were just maintaining the infrastructure to make sure everybody else could do their job. And then there were people that were publishing on novel algorithms to try to find specific kinds of information within the genome. Like, you know, we need to give credit where credit's due. That cytometry itself is a discipline, but there's a lot of science behind the software. There's a lot of science behind the reagents. There's a lot of science behind each of the individual components that form the whole. And somebody's got to be the academic that's willing to do the detail work, you know. The rest of us can put it together into a utility for the application.
Sure.
So definitely thanks for that shout out. That's absolutely well deserved too. So let's that was kind of like the past. Let's bring it into the present, because we're doing past, present, and future on this podcast. So I mean, I think all of us should answer the question about what we think is the hottest application for software right now. But Kraker, you go first. What do you think is hottest?
I mean, again, this is probably biased by my background, but and we can get more specific. You know, we probably will. But I mean, the thing that a lot of people want right now is algorithms. They want to wave the magic wand and have a nice wrapped data gift pop out the back end and get them that science paper. Many people walk in a lot more aware than that and knowing there's a lot of work to be done. But there's definitely an enormous amount, as experiments get more complicated, an enormous amount of effort that you have to put into even just optimizing and understanding the tools you use before you get the results from those tools and have to start interpreting those results. So
I call it kitting software. It was like the first time that we didn't have to pour our own gels, that we could like get pre-poured gels, or the first time that you could get a kit that had all your enzymes at the right concentrations to do some sort of, right? Like that's kind of an expectation for software now. Is like, I put in the late question of like, does anybody actually write in R anymore? Or is there this expectation that I should be able to just have a plug and play that somehow miraculously covers these relatively advanced applications, but we have to understand our tool in order that we feel confident in our, you know, the quality of our data and the reproducibility of it. So David, what do you, oh, sorry. Yeah.
No, I was going to say, yeah, I mean, there's, you know, a lot to get into, but I think that's, you know, algorithms just in general for good or, I mean, I think moving that direction is good, but I think there's a lot of people who are less familiar with them. And so are walking in maybe with not fully opened eyes as to how much work it's going to be. Data analysis will never be as simple as looking at, you know, 4-color data and being able to be like, well, those are my CD4s, those are my CD8s. You can't do that with, you know, 35-color experiment.
Program told me that they're there, therefore it must be true. I can just.
Yeah, or yeah, I mean the clustering thing, it's a whole nother can of worms, you know, like, look, I've got 277 clusters and they're all different. It's like, no, you just told me to cut your pie into 277 pieces. You know, so there's, I think algorithms are great, and I'm a huge proponent of employing them, but I think it's so important to learn about the tools you're using. So again, I'm sure we'll get closer into that, but that's my take.
What about you, David? What's hot for you right now?
Yeah, I mean, algorithms are obviously like the trendy thing, and if you want to get published, you know, troll the, you know, data analytics literature and then apply it to flow cytometry and come up with a cute acronym and sort of like a very Greek recipe.
A few people have done that.
And so that is obviously a big thing today, and it's new. There's a lot of new stuff. And, you know, we can certainly discuss that, but some other things that, you know, are really, that are affecting us. And that's what I've always found interesting about, you know, why, you know, I'm not bored after 20 years is things are always changing, even with the more basic stuff. And, you know, we deal, you know, we deal with a lot more than just, you know, analytics. And one of the things that we're getting that's really challenging now and interesting is integration with lots of other big systems. So it's kind of, you know, people are running so many experiments and so much data, and, you know, things, and this is more on the enterprisey level. It's a hot topic than, you know, Bob and Sue researcher in the lab who are running their 5 samples. But, you know, in the more enterprise level things, there's a lot of how to get data into software, how to get the results out of the software, how to re-import those results back in, how to add new experiments and get that to be put in the LIS in the right spot, all in a, you know, sort of automated or semi-automated manner. So that's actually, and that requires a lot of integration with like enterprise level boring IT systems. I mean, boring from you're not going to get a publication from it, but it's actually really challenging and really enabling once these systems are put together. You know, people just can move massive amounts of data through and analyzed very quickly. And some of the systems that, you know, we put together recently really like take data from sites that are around the world that are acquiring primary data from clinical trials, and the data is getting a primary analysis like over 4 continents and then getting automatically shipped to a central facility where it's reviewed by a standardized person, and then that's going automated to the LI. And so these systems, this is a very like trendy topic, and sort of like Geoff alluded to put one of them together, you can't get away with it without a 60-page security survey that you have to fill out in order to make it happen, which is, you know, another part of the process. So that's also kind of a new thing that is very challenging and interesting, that maybe people don't see, you know, all the time that's going on.
What about you, David? What excites you right now?
I don't do a whole lot of analysis in my position. Like I make sure the machine runs properly and my staff is trained. Part of it is training the users, and it's the constant battle of getting them up to date in what's getting done. And this is kind of, I don't know, it's not super easy to develop training program for our user base.
Well, that's why we have these guys.
That's why we have these guys.
Come and they meet you at your hotel lobby, and they they basically do it for you. It's fine.
Yeah. It doesn't scale, just FYI.
You're like, I don't actually work for beers.
And I do have to say that this last year has been exceptionally challenging in that regard of being able to support like to do training. And I mean, Zoom's all fine and wonderful and whatever, but nobody wants to sit on a 6-hour Zoom training session where people are perfectly happy. I mean, of course, with breaks, but in real life, people are perfectly happy to spend the day, you know, in an all-day training or half-day training. And like, you know, the suicide rate after 2 hours of flow cytometry Zoom training is very higher than one would expect. So that has been definitely a challenge.
Yeah,
fair enough.
Yeah.
So always a challenge anyway, you know, even at BioLegend, when we started getting more into SAS Express, I'm like, you guys, you have to play with it first. You've got to play with it for a couple of months. You've got to let it frustrate you a little bit. If you think that you're just going to start a training session without having some experience working through it, it's just not going to take as well, you know? Like,
that's the problem with any flow software these days, is that nobody wants to start. I mean, back in the day when I still had a lot more hair than I do now, I mean, you literally could start up because you were just doing a 2-color experiment. So how hard was it to figure out what you needed to do? And now people start with any new software and it's like, oh yeah, it's so simple. I just got this 12-color experiment and I need to do t-SNE and I got 200 samples and I need an Excel spreadsheet, but it's all very basic and I should be able to figure it out in 5 minutes, you know? And they have really unrealistic expectations of,
I mean, isn't that frustrating? I just press a button and it gives me all my different populations.
It just goes. So yeah, I mean, and it's understandable because people have other things to do than sit in front of the computer and make you know, figure out how to do stuff, and they don't want to do it. But it's just, you know, just like you need to learn to use the cytometer, you need to learn to use the software that you're using. And these days it's just, it's harder. It's just harder than it was.
And it's just on top, like flow cytometry is on top of everything else that any given researchers needs to know. So
I mean, when I was at Cytobank, we started out with just, you know, SPADE. That was like, you know, one of the first algorithm that they had. And the training was nice. You talked about the basics, how to gate and how to, you know, get stats out, and then SPADE. And then as you go through and you add, you know, they added more and more algorithms over time. You know, there's only so much training that you can do. And I'm sure, you know, Dave's run into this also. There's only so much training you can do. And at some point you switch from talking about how your software works to talking about like use cases for the algorithm and why it might be the right tool and how to use that tool and all the hyperparameters, the settings. You know, and it got to this point where I was like, look, you guys are going to have to start picking what algorithms you want me to talk about, because, you know, already training is difficult. There's a lot of options to work through. But you know, at some point you have to sit down and say, all right, look, you know, like I can't tell you everything, but everything, number one, because it takes longer than a day. And a lot of people are loath to spend, you know, 2 whole days listening to some guy talk, you know, or getting their boss to okay them, especially in industry. You know, that was a big thing. They had to fight to be like, look, I want to learn how to do this, but I'm still accountable for all this work at the end of the week, you know, and like, how am I going to squeeze all this in and take a day out to listen to you? So a lot of the time, you know, managers would be great about it, but you know, to take 2 days or 3 days out, I think that's totally unrealistic. So it's kind of, you know, it's not getting any easier either. There's not going to be ever fewer algorithms or less complicated data sets. So it's a consideration for sure.
Right to the next set of questions for you though. Like, I think that I must misuse these terms constantly. Like, I honestly, until I think you told me a year ago that I was totally wrong, I always thought that clustering and dimensionality reduction were, well, first of all, there's auto gating, clustering, and dimensionality reduction, right? And so you see some people kind of giving their auto gating talks at Cyto and things like that. And that has actually nothing to do with, that's really just still bivariate gating. It's just a nearest neighbor clustering of events, right? And so how, I guess that's my question, is just provide me like a minute of clarity as to what's the difference between those 3 things.
Yeah, for sure. So there's, I mean, they're all ways of looking at cells or grouping cells. They're just different strategies. So dimensionality reduction is, I like to think about it in my head, kind of like trying to give you the best possible picture of many dimensions in just 2, like a summary. So I use the analogy all the time of going from a globe to a map. You're going from 3D to 2D, and you make some sacrifices, but you get to see the whole thing at once, you know, and that's what people are interested in with their data, going from, you know, 35 colors down to just 2 parameters. That can be advantageous. It's not going to fix any problem, you know, but it'll help you get a better idea of what's going on in your data. So dimensionality reduction is basically a way to display similar events next to each other. And these are things like PCA, that's one of the first ones, principal component analysis, but also TSNE or UMAP or EmbedSOM. They're all algorithms for basically sticking similar events next to each other in 2 parameters or 3, or some of them you can do more. You can do 5 or 10 if you want to. PCA, you could do 30, you know, if that floats your boat. So that's typically people use it as a visualization tool. And then clustering is looking at how many events are, or how events are similar across all of your dimensions, or whatever dimensions you include in the algorithm kind of settings. And then saying, all right, I'm looking for X number of clusters, basically chop up my data into 50 pieces, putting the most similar cells next to each other.
I think I get it. Can I repeat back to you what I think I understand? Because I feel like I understand this.
Yeah, go for it.
You're saying, okay, I've got a 40 color assay. Mm-hmm. But you're saying because it's organized kind of based on cells instead of on parameters, I have 40 different parameters, and I'm going to reduce that down to a T cell or a B cell or something like that. Is that what I'm reducing down? Is that how I'm going from 40 to 2?
For the clustering or for the dimensionality reduction?
Dimensionality reduction.
No, not really.
Look at Dave. Like, no.
No, going from 40 to 2, I mean, it's just, what ends up, I mean, I say islands all the time when I'm describing things. Typically the way it works in single cell data, flow data specifically, that's what we're all familiar with, is each kind of major subset ends up being an island.
Hopefully.
I mean, depends on the settings and the quality of the data.
Customers, you're asking it to.
And yeah, there's a lot, but ideally, we'll say it that way. Ideally, each subset, CD4s or CD8s or B cells or NK cells or monocytes or, whatever ends up being their own little island. And inside of, for instance, the CD4 positive T cell island, there's a lot of subpopulations people are interested in, Tregs or naive or central memory or whatever. And they're kind of gradients within that island because they're very similar to each other, except for instance, if you're trying to find Tregs, you have only CD25 in your panel, so maybe you're not real Tregs, but it's an approximation. Those cells of interest are only different from your other normal RA positive or RA negative CD4s by one marker out of 40. So for the algorithm, it looks so similar, except for one parameter is just a little bit different. And so it kind of kicks it off to the side a little bit, but that's not enough difference to take those cells and bump them into their own new island. So that and what makes it cell different enough to get its own island is a lot more hand waving, more than even I'm doing. No, it's it has to do with the quality of the staining and how many markers you are using to differentiate them, et cetera. There's a lot going on, but
how many events are in there? Because isn't it also an issue to lose your rare populations if it doesn't seem to have enough events for it to create its own island?
No, so actually, it's one of the key strengths of dimensionality reduction is you don't have to have a minimum number of events. If you have one, for instance, say you run QC in the morning, and then you put on your first sample of the day, and there's one polystyrene bead or whatever still in there, that will show up in your tube. That will be all by itself way out in left field.
And
so
then
you can
one of your clusters, you told it to give it 70 clusters, and now you're down to 69 because you had one polystyrene.
Yeah, probably. Yeah.
One point I just wanted to make is that we one of the things I think the community has not done well, and again, it's because kind of everybody who presents these things wants to show how great their technology is, both if you invent a new algorithm or talking about the algorithms, is just how easy and how wonderful they are and what they do. And there was a whole period where autogating was all the rage before dimensionality reduction. And I can't tell you how many times I saw talks where people got up and they'll be like, manual gating is so stupid. Auto gating is so awesome. Auto gating just finds your populations. You don't have to do anything. Just run my algorithm and it'll come up and gate your data for you. And it's so reproducible, and we've done tests and it's the gold standard. And when we show the reproducibility of 10 experts versus our algorithm is great, and it just works all the time. And you're sort of hearing the same thing now about all these sophisticated algorithms, that these algorithms will do this and these algorithms will do that. And kind of even what Geoff said, if you have a single bead, it'll always just come off by itself. And it's not really necessarily true. The algorithms themselves, in Geoff's excellent example of projecting down onto a map, that is what the dimensionality, you take a globe and you project it down onto the map. And what's often highlighted is how awesome that is and how great you can see the whole thing. And what's not highlighted is how that distorts the map. And there's actually, when you look at a normal map, of course, the stuff near the poles is completely distorted distance-wise compared to the stuff near the equator. Greenland, and there's actually 4 or 5 common ways of projecting globes onto pieces of paper, and each of them distort one thing and preserve something else. And if you imagine that in 40 dimensions, the amount, what is being preserved is very, very specific compared to what's being distorted. There's a whole lot of stuff that's being distorted, and what's being preserved is very, very specific and very highly dependent on the algorithm you're doing and on the very specific settings that you put in to that algorithm. You can take the same UMAP on the same data set and tweak one of the 10 user adjustable parameters in a very small way and get a completely different graph. Particularly Tisney as well is kind of famous for that. You sneeze on the Tisney plot and all the dots will rearrange all over the place. So
even when the dots rearrange, how significantly is it still affecting your data? Like, this is one thing that I was always wondering with the number of clusters, if I can still understand and curate through my clusters and still make them, I may have if I have 60, 70, 80 different clusters, theoretically, as long as it's enough clusters, I can still put them together into a big gate to say, no, these are still my subset of, memory like some sort of memory subset or something like that. Like, does it matter so much that they're displayed totally different, as long as, maybe this is just because I haven't read the lit, let's be honest, but how much variability really is there if you're good at curating the content of each of your clusters?
Well, that's the point, is that you have to be good at curating the content of each of your clusters. You can make dramatic changes. I can't even tell you. And some of the changes are in rounding errors in the Tisney algorithm, because it runs 5 million times that these errors accumulate. And the graph can look dramatically different. Can you reinterpret it in the correct way? Potentially, potentially not. With different settings, the reason there are different settings in the algorithms is because the settings really affect how the final data looks. FlowSOM, for example, one of the last steps is a hierarchical clustering. And there's, 9 different metrics you can use to do hierarchical clustering, and they dramatically affect the final clustering.
I mean, we see that even in bivariate gating, let's be honest, depending on what parent came before, because you have a phenotype that's like 6 or 8 different markers, and how you choose to progress along that line can absolutely change what your final population is, when theoretically it should be positive for all of them. But there were choices that you made in one bivariate or the other before you got there. So it seems to me that sort of error judgment call being done by the algorithm, or it's being done by me, is going to introduce some error.
No, it's totally the case, except with the bivariate plot, it's sometimes easier to appreciate what you look up at your live gate and you're like, oh yeah, I missed half my live cells.
Right.
When you have a drop-down box for, it's there, right? Whereas
that's a problem child.
Whereas when you have an option screen for your FlowSOM, and there's an option of single linkage, aggregate linkage, average linkage, min linkage, max linkage, and 6 other linkages, how do you know what to pick? Like, you just don't.
You don't.
And
I never
as
know.
Geoff, and so like Geoff was saying earlier, like, people don't appreciate that these algorithms don't generally just work out of the box, that you need to spend a lot of time with them to get them to work with your data.
Yeah.
And that part of that is that they're not presented that way almost ever, except in talks that I give. In most talks that I've seen, they're all presented how wonderful they are, and you just click the button and they work. And it's almost never the case ever.
I mean, you can kind of say that about literally any emerging technology, because I've seen a lot of things more recently for people going above 24 parameters, where it makes it seem like really all you're just doing is running those cells. And the amount of QC and the amount of curation you have to do to make sure you can trust any of that is significant, but not worth it. Like, none of it is some negation of its value. It's just when we start working with higher, just more things, our responsibility to our data increases.
Yeah.
But to
100%.
me, the clusters were the same. I remember pulling aside Ryan Brinkman after one of his talks and totally not still seeing the difference between clustering and and dimensionality reduction, and just being like, I don't understand. How do I go in to know that you're right? I can't bring myself just to trust. You can't ask us to do that. We're scientists. I need to know that I can go through tediously and know that they all belong where they are, that I would have made the call manually that they should be where they are.
Yeah, I think that's super important, is you always have to go back to the biology. Clustering algorithms, however fancy or simple they get, don't know the biology. They don't know that CD25 is super important to you. And another one might not be. It might just be, oh yeah, that's a chemokine receptor I threw in just on a lark. I don't even really care that much about it. I had it. It looked like it would work, Or
that you're on your third plate, third row, third, and maybe you're starting to see some shift. you know, like,
Well,
and it's still trying to cluster and identify and.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, that's a whole, it's another can of worms is you know, kind of feeding good data to the algorithms. So all of this is assuming algorithms are very difficult. Best case scenario, you feed it great data. It's still tricky to make sure you're using the tool correctly. But you have to go back a few more steps and say, is the data I'm putting in good? Is it compensated or unmixed well? Are there batch effects? You know, I mean, if you want to get really pessimistic about it, like a few steps more, like, did I design the experiment well? Do I have enough statistical power? You know, like there's huge checkpoints kind of you have to work your way through. And if you meet, you know, the pass criteria on all of them, then you can get to the point where, you know, you can, you know, optimize your settings for your particular algorithm of interest and get something usable. But
that's a thing now, right? That you can basically say, do each of these wells meet a pass criteria?
I mean, it depends what you're thinking of. There's not to, you know, this is going to be, I'm sure, like, you know, a refrain at this point, but there's algorithms out there for checking data quality before you start doing a lot of work on it. Things
you were telling me about.
Pardon?
What was the one that you were telling me about that checks data quality?
There's one of the newer ones is FlowCut. I happen to like that one, but there's Flow AI and Flow Clean. There's
and in that case, you got to be careful, right? It's not really data quality as the quality of data. It's consistency of your data across your entire acquisition or your tube. That they're, you know, it's not. It doesn't. It is quality, but it's not like, oh, is that data high quality that it's going to give you the result you want? It's more like, was there a clog, and can I auto detect the perturbation in the flow that happened?
It doesn't check, exactly. That's a really important point. It doesn't check if your staining was done correctly or if your compensation or mixing was done correctly. It's just, you know, it's a portion of quality. Yeah. What was that, David?
I was just about to ask, are there any of these algorithms that so typically it's used for like higher parameter analysis. Would you recommend using any of these for just regular stuff that like somebody running a plate, for example, could run these type of algorithms just to clean up before doing their simple analysis? That,
and by cleanup you mean eject things that don't conform to the base?
Yeah, some like
a spike or an air bubble or a
correct.
surge.
Yes.
FlowCut and Flow AI are perfect for something like that. There's no,
Totally.
I mean, it's been a recommendation for a long time to look at the time plot if your thing had time and just kind of eyeball it or get some stat on it or see if there are outliers. This is just a more sophisticated way of doing that across all the parameters. So I would generally, it doesn't hurt if it's easy to do and as a preliminary step, it certainly doesn't hurt.
Is it easy to do? I feel like all of these algorithms are these weird plugins that I simply don't know what to do with.
Well, we're not going to be commercial here, so maybe that's just all a implementation detail of, you know, what software you happen to be using.
Right.
Yeah.
You know,
I mean,
if that was on the analysis side, where you could say, oh, before I package this to export it to be archived for the rest of my life, you know, to put it through some sort of sieve to say, no, I don't want anything archived except for the valuable, consistent elements of this data file. I mean, would it make sense for that to be on the analysis side?
Yeah, absolutely.
Or on the acquisition side, not the analysis side?
Oh, acquisition.
oh, so like a fancy threshold?
Kind of, yeah. Or even something that I run post, you know, when I get done with my experiment, I still have to, because we're not connected to the network, therefore there's many stages that we have. So what if I took that file in the acquisition software, filtered it real fast so that the end file that I'm then putting onto my desktop so that I can put it onto a flash drive so that I can put it onto my network, you know, is actually, because that's now actually stored on my laptop, you know, like it's stored in each of those places that I had to transfer it off of.
I mean, if you're never going to look at those events again, if the first gate you make is gating out doublets or debris or dead cells or whatever, I mean, if you just don't ever use those. Same thing. If you could gate out the cells that happen because there's a shift in fluorescence because, you know, the fluidics were screwed up in the first 3 seconds of your file. If you want to chop those out, you're never going to look at them. Yeah. Why not do that on the acquisition side before you even, you know, put it into an analysis software? Yeah, totally. How do you do that though? What was that?
Yeah, I was going to say, like, at least the acquisition software should warn you. Like, I don't know about throwing away the data, because Geoff has a good point. Like, why don't you throw away your dead cells before, and your doublets and your whatever? Well, generally because you want to look back and make sure that everything's okay when you're not rushed to get kicked off the instrument. But, you know, having a warning certainly from the acquisition side of saying, hey, this file has suspicious segments, you know, pay attention, that would be a kind of cool
I agree.
feature.
It'd be very nice.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I think it's a you know, a good point to mention, without like you said, without tiptoeing over the over into the commercial side of things. All of these algorithms that we're talking about that pop up, they're all available in R, usually through Bioconductor. So you can get them and run them for free. You don't.
Like,
So here's the thing. There's a stigma, and it's look, I have a biology degree. I didn't come from the computation side of things. I mean, I play computer games, but that's about as far as my computer expertise goes. And you know, I've been doing this for years. I mean, there's so many tutorials out there. I mean, there's an effort made to get graduate students and postdocs and I mean, people who don't have a lot of time or energy to put forward, you know, this effort to learn a new language, to get them up to speed, even at a baseline level. You don't have to know how to program an algorithm. You just have to know how to say, here's my data, here's the algorithm, take the data, stick it in, see what, you know, pops out the other side. And a lot of the time it'll just add, like, for instance, 2 new channels to your FCS files. And then you can look at those in your software of choice. So, you know, I want to maybe demystify the process a little bit. There's, it's really not terrible to kind of get started with this. You can, without having to pay for a graphical user interface for these algorithms. A lot of third-party software now has at least some of them included. But if you want to just tinker, I mean, it's a good skill to use or to learn anyways.
Does FCS Express have it, Dave, that you can add plugins?
So the version that we just released yesterday actually has a new system that actually we're trying to go the opposite of the way Geoff is describing. And we allow people now to build these algorithms by just dragging algorithmic steps visually. So instead of having to learn R and how to code these in R, you can drag and drop these algorithmic steps in whatever order you want and rearrange them visually. So I agree with Geoff. The ultimate flexibility is for people to learn a little bit of coding on your own. R and Python these days are both amazingly high level languages that if you're going to learn how to program, then that, or script or whatever you want to call it, those are not difficult to, relatively speaking. But also we're trying to give options for people who just have no interest in that. But they don't have to lose out. They can still do the vast majority of what people do. They just don't need to know how to program or script to do it.
Yeah, that's one thing I always loved about your software is it's almost like I don't know if this is the right way to word it, but like a Windows sort of, you know, it's very, the user
Windows
interface
themed
is very like, I know where to go looking for this because I don't know.
Well, there's too many, it's not as much as it used to be now that there's 700 drop-down menus and 4,000 features and whatever, but yeah, we try. We definitely try.
Yeah, that's, I mean, and so you described it, Dave, as, you know, being able to kind of, you know, put the pieces together. And that's absolutely a workflow. I mean, you know, people call it different names, but I think workflow is a decent way to describe it. It's no longer just putting, you know, oh, I'm gonna, like compensation, that's an algorithm. People have been running compensation on stuff forever, but it's just one step, right? You take your files, you compensate them, spits it out, and you're done. And it's becoming rarer and rarer. You only need to touch your files once with an algorithm. Typically it's clean them up, you know, with flow cut if you want, you know. Unmixing is an algorithm, comp is an algorithm, you spit, you know, it spits all that out, and then you put it through you know, a dimensionality like UMAP, you know, and then you take the information out of UMAP and you stick it into FlowSum, and you take that information out and you stick it through some statistical inference tool, So a lot of the work people are going to be doing, if they aren't already, is going to be linking several of these tools together. So yeah, I mean, I think that's the strategy going forward. And other people have it designed like this. OMIC, for instance, has kind of a workflow setup going on. It's definitely, I think, good to know how things are put together. And even if you don't have time or effort or the gumption to learn R, there are these tools out there to help you figure it out. But even if you don't know how to implement them, I really want to emphasize how important it is, and maybe this has already been addressed and probably will be again, but how important it is to know how to use the tools. You can't hammer a nail in with a saw easily. Can it be done? Probably. Should it be done? Certainly not. There are certain algorithmic tools that are appropriate for some situations and some that are not. And knowing how to use the right tool for the right job and then interpret the results correctly is super important. And Kelly, you said this before, it's, people don't realize the effort that's required to put into these things. Algorithms don't help you. They don't make it easy. They just make it slightly less hard to analyze the sheer amount of data or the complexity that's coming out of experiments we're seeing these days.
So your answer touched on, I think, what we can probably use to finish up this podcast. So this is what I think the future of cytometry software is. And I would love to hear your opinion on whether this is at all feasible, because I'm guessing it's not particularly feasible. But I saw this talk, saw two different talks. One was Bob Balderas at San Diego Cytometry Society. I think, Kraker, you were even in town for that one. It was a really long time ago, so it's obviously not something that they're releasing anytime soon. But it was basically a way of intelligent panel design. And so it was taking into account how you were going to gate, what the specifications of your instrument were. These were all files that you added, and it made these bivariate decisions to literally suggest the floor for the marker. You gave it measures of variability of expression, anything that we would have been doing between a stimulated and an unstimulated control. You would say, this is variable, this is not variable, this is yes or no, and you would give it the information for it to make intelligent decisions. So that was like one thing that, from my perspective as a dye developer, was just like, yeah, I mean, when I started doing that, it was all about, just those horrible Excel sheets and trying to figure out who even offered things commercially so that I didn't have to conjugate my own Percy PSI 5.5 or, XYZ. So in my mind, there's this perfect panel builder out there that's not Fluorofinder and not any of the things that are commercially on other commercial websites right now. And then secondary to that, I saw a talk from Mario at, must have been at Stanford. It was their Southern California flow something or other. And his was showing how he correlated twins. It was twin samples, their clinical diagnosis with their clinical outcome, the way that a clinician would grade it, severity wise, with all of this molecular data from the flow cytometry and the way that he was integrating across all these. Those were all massive data sets. The flow was just one part of this correlation that we were actually looking to make meaningful clusters from, and that was just like, because talk about taking a rare disease, and there's still variability in there, that those clinicians have to be honest about how they're grading the severity or the effect of the disease. But especially with COVID right now, trying to find why some people did and didn't respond. It's not just about the flow data. When did they present? What was the duration from the time they presented with meaningful clinical symptoms to the point at which they needed to get to the hospital because they had progressed to a certain level, and then with those molecular markers, like, will there someday be this way of clustering all the meaningful components and not just the molecular data. This is my dream. I'm going to make $1 million off of it. I know it.
I mean, strangely enough, the technology is exactly the same. I mean, it's just more data, right? It's just more like, okay, for patient Kelly Lunston, I've got 40 parameters of flow, you know, across however many days that we measured you. And I've got, you know, this many molecular data, and I've got, you know, what the doctor thought you looked like and what the doctor sounded and what your how high your knee went during the reflex test, and, you know, all that stuff. And then after we do it all, we find out that, oh, you actually are the most wonderful person on earth, and it's been scientifically proven, and that's the cluster you're in, you know. So it is interesting that, like, although it's crap loads more data, fundamentally, and you'd probably have to throw crap loads more algorithms at it to pull out this and that and clean it in different ways. But fundamentally, it's kind of the same thing we deal with all the time. It's just a lot bigger than that. You know, it's 40 parameters, 25,000.
You work on it?
No.
The next thing on your list to work on?
No, it's a really hard problem. There's a lot of people, especially in high-paying pharma jobs,
yeah,
who are focused on exactly that question. Data integration, making sure you can use all the tools that you have together is great. And these algorithms, a lot of them weren't developed exclusively, at least originally, for flow cytometry. Like FlowSom, that is, but self-organizing maps, the SOM part of it, have been around in the data science field way before, you know, it got released in flow cytometry. Same with t-SNE. t-SNE wasn't developed for flow cytometry specifically, and the applications are much broader. People use it. I mean, all of the whole family of the t-SNE algorithms for satellite imagery and social networking, and, you know, like, so the algorithms can handle, like Dave said, algorithms can handle this. It's not, you know, they're not going to have trouble with the not flow. You just have to make sure the data is scaled correctly, you know, and a lot of it, I mean, if you're doing a lot of comparisons also, you have to make sure the statistics work out. And I'm not a statistician, so I don't have a right answer for it. But if you're doing an enormous amount of comparisons to try and tell the difference between two groups, why, you know, somebody is one way or, you know, somebody else is the other, there's a lot of considerations you have to make in that regard. But yeah, I mean, I think it's a super admirable. I mean, that's where people are headed. You know, is looking at more than just one technology's worth.
Well, and that adds your single cell sequencing data onto that. The difference, what is really the difference not epidemiologically. What are the difference between those two twins in all reality? Like
epigenetically, yeah.
Epigenetically is the word I was looking for. There you go.
Yeah.
This was a very, very informative discussion. Thank you guys so much for participating with us.
Thanks for the invite.
So much for teaching us about software when we are not always the best to teach. So your patience is extremely, you know, awesome.
Always come find us at conferences once they start up again.
Once they start up again, I'll be glad to have that problem.
For teaching you.
For sure. For sure.
All right, thank you everybody for joining us, and we'll see you next month.
Woo! Thanks, guys.
Bye.
Bye.